All right, now to another top Democrat facing fresh scrutiny. A resurfaced clip from the 1990s shows Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer backing ID checks to crack down on welfare fraud. Fast forward to today, and he's fighting voter ID requirements in federal elections. Take a look at then Congressman Schumer.
Let's admit the truth. Everywhere people go, they're asked for a Social Security card. In fact, one way to prove you're a bona fide person who can have a job is to ask for a driver's license and a Social Security card.
All right, let's bring in Missouri Republican Senator Eric Schmidt. It's amazing the way people evolve over time. You're for ID for one thing, to cut down on fraud, waste, and abuse in the welfare system. But now when it comes to voting, you're against it. I mean, how do you make that change?
Well, I think Chuck Schumer, in this specific instance, his journey on this is kind of indicative of the Democrat Party, which once was sort of a mainstream political party and now has reached a level of absurdity and really honestly at war with common sense. If you poll this issue, it's 80 plus, there aren't many issues that are like that, including among Democrats. 70 plus percent of Democrats believe you should actually have to show a photo ID to vote. It's about basic election security.
All right, well, just to remind folks at home what he says about the SAVE Act, listen to him here.
The SAVE Act is nothing more than Jim Crow 2.0. If the SAVE Act were to become law, online registration, registration by mail, and registration drives would become a thing of the past. This is just an outrageous piece of legislation. It's turning the clock back 100 years.
You know, buried inside there probably is one of the real reasons why the Democrats don't want this, when he says online registration, registration by mail, and registration drives would become a thing of the past. Those are things that the Democrats are very, very good at. And if you throw a voter ID requirement in there, they're afraid they're not going to be able to do it to the degree that they have.
Take a look here. Favorite photo ID to vote. 85% of white people favor it. 82% of Latino. 76% of Black Americans favor it. So the bottom line is this. Voter ID is not controversial in this country. A photo ID to vote is not controversial in this country. It is not controversial by party, and it is not controversial by race. The vast majority of Americans agree with Nicki Minaj that, in fact, you should have a photo ID to be able to vote.
First things first, when's the last time, would you have guessed, would it be on your bingo card that Nicki Minaj would be invoked on CNN to talk about political policy? Probably not. Ask somebody 10 years ago, probably wouldn't be on their radar. But also, here's the thing. This is actually a good point that I don't think many people are making. The reason that everybody on both sides of the political aisle think that people need to show an ID to be able to verify that they're eligible to vote is that nobody trusts each other. Seriously, on both sides of the political spectrum, they accuse each other of cheating. Now, how do you fix that in a bipartisan way? Make it impossible for people to cheat. People don't trust each other, and they shouldn't. Therefore, let's maybe design a system where cheating is not a possibility, or at the very least, very, 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 very difficult to do. Look, the idea, if you were to use an analogy, is that saying, well, nobody's broken into my house recently, is not a good argument to not lock your door. But that, unfortunately, is the case that libs continue to make. They say, wow, there's not a whole ton of voter fraud out there. Okay, well, one, I don't necessarily know if I believe that. And two, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't steal door this election process. That would be crazy to not do that. I mean, there's a ton of examples out there, but let's just one. Recently, the United States District Office in Pennsylvania arrested a guy, 50 years old, who allegedly voted 5 times and was not eligible to vote. And here's the thing, he wasn't even here legally. This wasn't a, permanent resident, a green card holder who was in the country and happened to vote because maybe he thought he was able to. No, this is a guy who entered the country and was here illegally, who was somehow able to register to vote and cast multiple ballots. And I say that because that's just one kind of fraud. There are many other different kinds of fraud that people could participate in. For example, in a state like California that doesn't check your ID, if I happen to know that my neighbor isn't going to vote and I show up and I say, oh, I'm him, or California doesn't have to show ID, so what's stopping me from doing that? Now, of course, I wouldn't because I have some sense of morality. But the problem is, well, other people would, so you should try to stop them from doing that. In my opinion, too, libs are effectively all but admitting that voter fraud occurs. Here is the House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, in my opinion, basically admitting that voter fraud happens because he talks about the one hill that libs will die on when it comes to ICE/DHS reform.
We are in a DHS shutdown right now because Republicans have refused to agree to the type of bold, transformative, meaningful, and dramatic reforms we are demanding in order for the Department of Homeland Security funding bill to move forward. And I won't go through all of the demands, much of which we've talked about repeatedly in the public, but one of those demands is keep ICE out of sensitive locations. And we've defined that as schools, houses of worship, hospitals, and polling sites. We want an explicit prohibition that ICE can go nowhere near any polling sites in the United States of America. It's one of our demands. We're not going to bend on it.
What an odd hill to die on, right? Because the obvious question is, okay, well, if illegals aren't voting, then it shouldn't be a problem that ICE or immigration enforcement goes into polling places, unless, of course, they are voting. Also, what's fascinating about this is he says, well, we've got a lot of different demands, but here's the most important one. That's the most important one as to why they're not going to continue to fund DHS. Now, again, he's not necessarily talking about the voter ID issue. He's talking about, well, we shouldn't have immigration enforcement in polling places, again, which is an odd thing to say. Now, more broadly, what's fascinating to me is not only the arguments that libs are making, but the arguments that they're not making, is that this is unconstitutional, which it isn't, but at least it's a decent argument, or at the very least, it sounds good. Like, for example, nobody on the left regarding voter ID and the federal government injecting itself into elections is quoting Article 1, Section 4 of the Constitution, which says the times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof. Which sounds like it's a state issue, right? Or at least libs could make that argument. Now, the argument breaks down immediately when you read the following line, which says, but the Congress may at any time by law make or alter such regulations. But remember, libs lie all the time. What I'm saying here is they could quote the Constitution and make that argument as if it were unconstitutional, which I know it's not, but I'm saying libs lie all the time, so why aren't they doing that? Unless, of course, by some stroke of, I don't know, imagination, maybe libs actually are aware that the federal government does have the power to say, hey, you need to have an ID, which it does. So interestingly enough, instead of making that argument, saying, well, this is unconstitutional, they're making an argument appealing to the dumbest among us. Here is Senator Hirano, Senator from Hawaii, Mazie Hirano, who's very, very silly. Here is her making the case against voter ID in the United States of America, which, again, she doesn't use the unconstitutional stuff. She uses the race stuff.
This is not about voter ID. Oh, stop that. That's like a total bullshit description of the SAVE Act. Let me just focus on one part of the SAVE Act. In order to register to vote, you're going to have to show different pieces of documents. So if you're, let's say, a woman who got married, changed your last name, and if your last name doesn't match the name on your birth certificate, you're not going to be able to register to vote. That I call stealing our votes.
Yeah, I mean, aside from that being debunked a number of times, including on this show, what if we attack her from the left? Hey, Senator Hirano, Senator Mazie, women aren't the only ones that get married and change their names. Some men hyphenate. It's not a good argument to make from the lib side of the aisle, but it's not a good argument to make from her standpoint as well. Everybody is aware of, okay, well, yeah, you just, bring your birth certificate or you bring your marriage license. And if you don't have any of those and you have no way of proving who you are, why should we let you vote in the country? Interestingly enough, kind of prove the point that we were trying to make in this weird subvertive way that only a lib would understand and think, wow, this is a great argument.
What's the SAVE Act? That's not about ID. It's about registration. It's about who gets to vote, who doesn't get to vote. They are not screwing around.
Yes, that is kind of the point. It's about who gets to vote. Now, he's saying, well, it's only who conservatives want to vote, because those are the only people that would have the ability to prove that they're eligible to vote. But without putting it in that context, Governor Newsom kind of makes the point that we're trying to make. Yes, it is about who gets to vote. That's the whole thing. We don't want people who are ineligible to vote to be able to vote. I think, honestly, this argument made by the minority leader in the Senate, Senator Schumer, is the worst of the worst. He's making this argument, which not only is absurd, but deeply, deeply offensive.
The SAVE Act will not pass because it is such a pernicious, nasty piece of legislation. The SAVE Act is Jim Crow 2.0. More than 20 million people would lose their right to vote.
Now, the fact that they are still calling it Jim Crow 2.0 should be incredibly offensive to anybody who doesn't like to see racism in this country. And I say that really kind of throwing that back in the lib's face, because what he's doing effectively is equating some of the worst things that this country has ever done. And I say that knowing that several conservatives are like, oh, this didn't happen. We're debunking this and that. And yeah, there's a lot of nuance going on here, but Jim Crow did exist. The Jim Crow South was an actual thing. But what Senator Schumer is effectively doing is belittling, showing your ID to vote is belittling some terrible things that, again, actually happened. Just to remind people, Jim Crow had separate public facilities. There were laws requiring separate drinking fountains, restrooms, and waiting rooms marked whites only and colored only, which were enforced by the law. There were segregation in public transit. Laws requiring black passengers to sit in the back, white passengers to sit in the front. There were conditions in restaurants. There was businesses that segregated black and white. There were residential segregation. There were laws that enforced, these racial zoning neighborhoods. Now, again, not a good thing. It doesn't also help us to deny that that sort of stuff happened, because it did, not necessarily in the way that libs portray it. But yes, what I'm saying ultimately is Jim Crow was bad. School segregation, public segregation, interracial marriage in a lot of places were banned. What I'm trying to get at here is that Senator Schumer, by equating showing your ID to vote to Jim Crow laws, belittles anybody that had to live through Jim Crow laws, which doesn't dignify people of color at all in the country. Having to hand somebody an ID in order to vote is the same as racial segregation. What people would do in their heads by default would be like, oh, okay, so Jim Crow wasn't that bad. No, it was pretty bad. But Senator Schumer, by equating, simply proving that you have the ability to vote to Jim Crow, effectively says, Jim Crow wasn't that bad. Racial division in this country wasn't that bad, which is exactly the opposite of what libs often do.
The only reason you vote against voter ID is because you want to cheat. There's no other reason. They come up with reasons. They say, it's racist. That's their number one, racist. Then you have to explain it, and they're just sitting there mumbling. They can't explain it. And it's actually very insulting when they use the term racist. Very insulting to the people that they're trying to so-called defend, but they're not defending.
President Trump is so good at, one, kind of laughing at it. It's like, it is. And also, putting it in concise terms. It is offensive. It should be offensive. If you are a black person in America, if you are a woman in America, you should be offended by legislators saying, you're too stupid to get an ID. You're too dumb to have a marriage certificate. These things are so astronomically difficult that you can't do it, not because of anything other than your race and or gender. It is. It should be offensive to everybody. It shouldn't be belittling to, terrible things that happen in this country. It shouldn't be all of these things, and yet it still is for some reason for the people on the lefty side of the aisle. Everybody agrees on this. I would hope that especially even conservatives at the very least bring this up for a vote, because at this point, that hasn't even happened yet. So, how will this shake out? Honestly, I'm not entirely sure. Anybody who says they're definitely sure, I don't know, they don't have a crystal ball, they can't see the future. But what I will tell you is the only sure thing here is that one, it is very, very reasonable, and two, the majority of people agree with it.